Hey, what's up YouTube? This is Tcg Sam here, and I'm coming at you guys today with a discussion on whether you should be playing hand traps or board breakers in your deck. So while I'm making this video currently in the July 2022 format, I'm hoping that these principles will be applicable to you no matter when you're watching this video. So if you guys enjoy this type of content, be sure to let me know by leaving a like, commenting, and subscribing. It'd really help the channel grow and I'd really appreciate it. But with that being said, let's just hop straight into the video. So first of all, why should you even play these cards, and why are they important nowadays in modern Yu-Gi-Oh? So in terms of hand traps, they're very important for preventing your opponent from making a board when you go second. So when you lose the die roll, which is on average about 50% of the time, your opponent's most likely going to be going first and trying to set up a board so that they are able to win the game from there. Hand traps prevent you from just freely letting your opponent do whatever they want and give you some form of interaction on their very first turn when you haven't even had a turn yet, which is very important in modern Yu-Gi-Oh, considering how incredibly powerful some of the modern decks are. In terms of board breakers, they're meant strictly as going second cards that you see in your hand to nullify or remove threats on your opponent's board. So once your opponent sets up that board, these board breakers are powerful enough so that they're able to allow you to play the game by breaking your opponent's board, sometimes even single-handedly. So we're going to be talking about why you should be playing hand traps and some of the benefits of playing these hand traps in your deck. So first of all, they stop your opponent from even making a board to begin with, which is something that I mentioned. And this can be very important against decks that generate a lot of advantage through their regular combos or have multiple depths of interruption. What I mean by that is if you consider something like the Punk Adventure deck right now, during their regular combo, they have Shooting Riser Dragon to dump Fairy Tale Snow to the graveyard. And if they go completely uninterrupted, not only do they set up a very powerful end board, but they also have a lot of advantage in their graveyard with like Fairy Tale Snow and additional follow-up. So having hand traps to stop your opponent from even getting started and getting to this part of their combo can be very important and very beneficial, and is one of the biggest reasons, in my opinion, to play hand traps. Like I also mentioned, it prevents them from gaining advantage through their plays. So if you have a combo that lets you gain lots of card advantage or lots of follow-up, being able to stop it in its tracks right at the beginning can be very important, just in case you're not able to kill your opponent on the following turn. And finally, there are hand traps that can potentially just shut down your opponent's entire turn, whether it's because their hand wasn't good, or it's because it's a very well-timed hand trap, like a very powerful Nibiru, the Primal Being. So these types of cards can be very beneficial because, like I mentioned earlier, they give you an option to play on your opponent's very first turn, whereas you haven't even had a turn yet. Now that's all well and good, but what are some of the downsides of playing hand traps? Because there definitely are quite a few. So the very biggest downside is that it's sometimes, more often than not, useless outside of your opening 5 cards. We all know that feeling of drawing a Nibiru the Primal Being as our 6th card while our opponent has already done their full combo, and at times you just kind of wish you weren't playing those cards in your deck. A lot of the times in modern Yu-Gi-Oh, more often than not, decks will set up a board such that they're able to stop you on their turn and then OTK you the following turn if you're not able to put up any sort of meaningful resistance. Meaning, even if you draw a hand trap as your 6th card, it can potentially just completely be useless that game and not offer you any benefits at all. And nowadays, there is a big problem with Yu-Gi-Oh where you actually require multiple hand traps to completely shut down your opponent. So if you consider something like an Ash Blossom and Joy Spring, this is a very powerful hand trap that can trade 1-for-1 very well with a lot of the cards in the game. But if you could just consider how a lot of combo decks just are full of extenders, full of great starters, your opponent may still be able to continue playing even after you use your Ash Blossom optimally, which can be a big problem because it definitely reduces the chances of you drawing some of the other cards in your deck if you're packing them full of hand traps, just so you have a better chance of drawing multiple when going second. It's also important to note that certain hand traps are just very low impact or just completely useless in certain scenarios and against certain matchups. So if you consider, let's say, Fluwandereeze as a deck, something like Ghost Bell and Haunted Mansion or DD Crow just can be completely dead against them. And it's also important to note that even while you have those cards against against decks they're good against, in certain instances they may not be that good. So for example, if your opponent's able to, let's say, set up a Appaloosa with their Scythe Lock and you only have a DD Crow as your hand trap, then the DD Crow is essentially nullified and doesn't really do anything there. So overall, the biggest downsides of playing hand traps, it's kind of luck based in the sense that you have to see in your opening hand, you have to see the right ones, and you have to see multiples at times. So this is definitely something to consider if you wanted to play hand traps in your deck. Alright, so let's move on to talking about the board breakers. So board breakers, what are some of the benefits of playing these cards? Well, they can be enough to single-handedly break many boards. If you consider something like Dark Ruler No More a very incredibly powerful card against those big monster boards because your opponent can't activate monster effects in response to the card's activation. Meaning that while you don't necessarily get rid of all their monsters, essentially, in modern Yugioh, having a board full of monsters that don't have any effects is kind of equivalent to having an empty board because many decks are just able to easily break them nowadays. So something like Dark Ruler No More, like you only need that single card to break an entire board at times, and that can make board breakers a lot more appealing because you don't have to play as many of them, and you have a higher chance of just being able to break your opponent's board entirely because you drew such a powerful card. Building on that, it can be drawn into as a 6th card or off of draw cards like Pot of Desires. So what this means is, mathematically speaking, you have a greater chance of seeing these cards when you're going second. So drawing that 6th card when you're going second, that's an additional opportunity for you to see these cards. And a lot of the times, simple draw cards won't necessarily always be negated by your opponent, so that gives you even more chance to draw these cards. It also generally has wider coverage of most matchups than just individual hand traps alone. So for example, if you consider something like Droll and Lockbird, it's incredibly good against those combo decks, but against control decks, it can just completely be dead. Whereas on the other hand, if you consider a board breaker like Evenly Matched, it can be good against both combo and control decks because it has applications in both, meaning that you'll have a greater breadth of matchup coverage for each of the cards that you're playing in your deck, which is very important in modern deck building because you only have such a limited space to play these cards in your deck. So what are some of the downsides of playing board breakers? Well, the biggest one is that it doesn't hinder your opponent at all during their turn. What I consider a board breaker is, like I mentioned, cards like Dark Ruler, Evenly Matched, Raigeki. So these are cards you can't use on your opponent's turn if you go second and lose a die roll. And in a lot of cases, like I mentioned in the hand trap one, your opponent's going to be generating a lot of advantage turn one. So something like Red Rose Dragon is going to allow them to generate tons and tons of advantage, even if you're able to break their regular board. And even in extreme cases can lead to you just instantly losing the game to something like a Candid Soldier FTK. Now I know this is very niche, but this is kind of just something to consider, that not being able to stop your opponent can be very detrimental to you just because of how much advantage and the potential ability for your opponent to just do some crazy things if you don't stop them at all. And also, the board breakers are useless most of the time when you're going first. So if you consider something like Raigeki, Dark Ruler No More, if you see these in your opening hand and you're going first, well, they're not really going to do anything at all because your opponent's going to have nothing on their board. And this, compared to something like hand traps where you can actually use them on your opponent's first turn after you finish your turn, these board breakers can add to additional clumping and bricking in your deck, and that can be very problematic for certain decks. And it also make it so you'll kind of feel like you wish it was a hand trap instead to be able to disrupt your opponent. And then finally, it doesn't offer as much flexibility as hand traps at certain times. So for example, something like Dark Ruler No More and Raigeki are only good for clearing monster boards. What if your opponent doesn't set up a monster board or doesn't set up enough interaction to warrant being like using Dark Ruler or Raigeki? So like they can set up, like, let's say an Eldritch the Golden Lord, and that just doesn't really do anything in that situation. Whereas something like Ash Blossom Joyspring can cover the draw cards in the Eldritch deck, can cover those combo matchups by stopping their starters. And Yeah, exactly. That's exactly why board breakers just sometimes just aren't that flexible, and that can be a big problem as well when you need to consider when you're deciding if you should put these cards in your deck. So finally, as a general summary and things to consider, when should you actually play hand traps or board breakers? Now I'm just going to preface this by saying what I'm saying here is very general, very oversimplified. There are a lot of different things you need to consider, and of course there are going to be exceptions to this quote-unquote rule that I'm giving you, but it's a very good baseline for you to consider when you're deciding whether you should play hand traps or board breakers in your deck. So in terms of hand traps, you should consider them in formats where you can't allow your opponent to set up. So for example, something like in the July 2022 format, something like Artifact Scythe is a very problematic card that your many decks going first are able to set up. So if your deck's just gonna lose to Artifact Scythe, it doesn't matter if you have something like Raigeki or Evenly Matched to clear the rest of their board, because you're essentially having your turn skipped when the Scythe resolves. It's also important when hand traps are able to hit non-combo matchups. So for example, in combo-based formats like the one we are in right now, hand traps and board breakers are very good, but what if in a Nightmare world, Fluandereeze is like the most represented deck and everyone's playing Fluandereeze? Well then, certain hand traps just won't be as good, and board breakers will be better in that format because of that specific non-combo matchup that you're going into a lot. Speaking of board breakers, you should consider them in formats where hand traps are either too low impact or boards aren't very complex. So for low impact hand traps, for example, let's say something like Ash Blossom is never enough to stop your opponent's entire full combo. At that point, you may just want to consider playing a board breaker instead that's able to clear their entire board, as opposed to just hoping you draw enough hand traps or hoping their hand is bad enough that your single hand trap can stop them. Board breakers can also be better when boards aren't very complex. So what I mean is, let's say your opponent has like only monsters as their form of interaction. Well, a single Dark Ruler is just going to be able to clear that entire thing, no problem. Or let's say your opponent doesn't put up any spell or trap negates, but puts up a lot of monster negates. Something like Raigeki or Evenly Matched can also be very good in those situations, just because your opponent is not going to have a way to clear them. So if your opponent, let's say, has no graveyard interaction, no hand traps, no spell and trap interaction, just a bunch of monsters on the board, these hand traps can be board breakers, can be very good. One last thing, I put these cards specifically like DD Crow for Forbidden Chalice because I see them as kind of a middle ground between the two. DD Crow is obviously a hand trap, but it also can be a quote-unquote board breaker in a sense if your opponent has a lot of graveyard interactions. So you're able to essentially stop something like Artifact Scythe from coming out. You're able to stop something like Fairy Tale Snow. Forbidden Chalice also technically is a board breaker, but you can also kind of think it kind of plays the role of a sort of hand trap as well. Going first, you're able to set it as like a trap card, and of course, going second, you're able to just trade one for one with one of your opponent's interruptions. And yeah, these are just some examples of something that I would consider a middle ground. But there are obviously many cards out there that are like this. But that's gonna do it for this video, guys. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Let me know what you thought about it in the comment section below. I know I may have overgeneralized some stuff or just made some assumptions that aren't necessarily correct in every format, so keep that in mind. This will hopefully be applicable to most formats, but in some formats things change in Yu-Gi-Oh, so maybe this won't necessarily apply in the format that you're watching this in. But with that being said, I just want to thank you guys so much for watching, and I hope you enjoyed once again, and I will see you guys in the next one. Take care.